Okie dokie, folks. Now we're getting into ecology, or the study of interactions. And before we get a little bit further into what we're going to talk about today, let's review the levels of organization that we talked about in biology and see how ecology is intertwined with what we've already talked about. So starting off at the bottom, we started off with atoms, and the atoms that we mostly talked about were carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Or if you want to remember this in a simple way, it would be schnapps. Those different atoms come together to form biological molecules. And those biological molecules would be our carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Once we have those four macromolecules interacting, that gives us organelles. And if you remember, organelle simply translates to tiny organ inside of a cell. So the next level would be cells. And specifically, this would be an osteocyte, or a type of bone cell. So once we get different types of bone cells working together, that would give us bone tissue. And different types of bone tissue would give us an actual bone, which, believe it or not, a bone is considered an organ. Why? Because it's made up of different types of tissues. So multiple bones, or all the bones actually, would give us the skeletal system. And there's actually 11 different systems that help make up animals. So all interacting systems, so the nervous system, the muscular system, respiratory and circulatory system, and etc., that would help give us an actual organism. In this case, we'd be looking at an elephant. So, so far, these are the levels of organization that we've talked about in class, and ecology is actually going up the levels after the organism. So what's after the organism? After the organism would be a population. And in a population, you're looking at all of the interacting members of one species. In this case, it would be how do all the elephants interact in one location, in one area. A good way to think about this is when you're driving into a new city and you see the sign on the city that says, "Welcome to Corcoran, population 23,000. That number on that population sign, that's only referring to just the people, just the members of one species, or humans. Now, once we start looking at other things, or all interacting species in an area, that gives us a community. So in this community, we would include the elephants, the zebras, the antelope, and all the life, even all the plants and bacteria. That would form a community. What's above a community would be an ecosystem. And in this ecosystem, we would look at not only all the living things, but also the non-living things. So such as the availability of water, what's the temperature like, the humidity, the amount of rainfall. All of those things would help create the ecosystem. And finally, the last level of organization would be the biosphere. And in the biosphere, we're looking at everywhere on planet Earth that is capable of sustaining life. And that is the last level of organization. So where does biology and ecology, what's the difference between the two? Well, if we're looking at biology, essentially what biology is looking at is what makes up life and how does that life function. And when we look at ecology, it's looking at how does life interact with other life and how does it interact with its environment. That's the main focus of ecology. So an easy way to remember the different levels of organization in ecology is a simple word. It's BECPO. And if you could remember BECPO, it'll help you remember the different levels. So B would be the biosphere. E would be ecosystems. C would be communities. P, populations. And O would be the organism. Organism. There you go. So next we have to go into the difference between biotic and abiotic factors. And if you remember what the prefix bio means, I hope you remember what bio means. Bio means life. And anytime you see an A in front of a word, such as abiotic, that A is telling you it is not that. So for example, abiotic factors, the A means not, bio means living, so abiotic would be not living. So a couple biotic factors in this ecosystem, we would include all the life. So it would be the plants, the animals, bacteria, fungi, and anything that is living in that ecosystem. When we talk about abiotic factors, we would look at things that have never been alive. So things such as water, the composition of the water. Is there salt in that water? What kind of minerals are in there? The soil, again, what's the composition of the soil? The pH, temperatures, and sunlight. Humidity and even rainfall. Those would all be abiotic factors because they've never been alive before. Next, we have to go into the difference between a habitat and a niche. A good way to remember a habitat niche is a habitat is a home. Think of habitats as homes, and a niche is a job or purpose in that home. Now, multiple organisms, they can all share the same habitat, or they could all share the same home. However, there really can't be more than one species that has the same job. So, for example, if you look at an ant, there can be plenty of ants living under this log or around this log, and this would be the log would actually be a habitat. Now, what's the ant's niche or job going to be in that habitat? It would be to eat dead insects. When we look at a millipede, the millipede also will share the same habitat as this ant. Now, what's the niche of the millipede going to be? The millipede is going to help and eat decaying leaves and other decaying organic material that's in the area. A centipede also would live in the same habitat. However, a centipede is actually a predator. It's going to fight off other insects such as beetles. And lastly, the moss growing on that log, that would be its niche would be to help decay that rotting log and return that organic material back into the soil. So if you look at all four of these organisms share the same habitat and they have the same home. However, they have very different jobs or very different niches in that home. And remember, there can only be one organism per job, one species per job, and we'll get into why in just a moment. So next, before we could go into energy transfer, we have to go over some basic vocabulary. Anytime you see the prefix auto means self or on its own, and troph means food. If you ever see the word hetero means different or other, and again, troph means food. So looking at these two images right here, an example of an autotroph would be a plant, because a plant can produce the food on its own. It doesn't need any assistance. It does it on its own through photosynthesis. Now when we look at heterotrophs, heterotrophs can't make their own food. They have to go out and find it or eat other organisms to attain that food. So for example, this panda bear would be eating a plant, and he's eating another organism to obtain that food or energy. So this brings us into energy flow in an ecosystem. And if you think about it, all of our energy is coming in from the sun. And we're getting this constant input of energy, but it's not available to us because we can't make nutrition from that energy. Only plants can, or producers. So if you look at this food chain, at the bottom of every food chain is going to be a producer or something that goes through photosynthesis, such as plants. This case would be corn or maize. Now, how is this energy going to get transferred to other organisms? Well, remember, first you're going to have the producer. And every level after the producer is called a consumer, or something that has to eat the food. So this locus, we would call that a primary consumer. And anytime you see the word primary, I want you to think of first. So this is the first level that has to eat something, okay? The next trophic level would be the secondary consumer, and in this case, it would be a lizard. Secondary means second. So the secondary consumer is the second level that has to eat an organism. Remember, this producer didn't have to eat an organism. It was able to make its nutrition on its own. Next, we go to the tertiary consumer, and tertiary simply means third. So this is the third level of consumers that had to eat something. Now, when you're looking at a food chain, you're going to see these arrows, and the arrows are very important. What the arrows are indicating is they're showing the flow of energy. It is telling you the energy that's stored in this corn is going to the locust. Now there's going to be energy trapped in that locust. The energy in that locust is going to flow to the lizard. Now there's energy trapped in the lizard. That lizard, its energy is going to go to the snake. Okay, so what do the arrows show? The arrows simply show the direction that energy is traveling. So if we look at a next model that demonstrates energy flow, that would be a food web. And essentially all a food web is, it's multiple types of food chains that are clumped together. So if you look here, we have berries, and the berries could go to the green fly, to the ladybird, to the dragonfly. That's one food chain. Now, the food web could also show multiple pathways. The berries could go to a butterfly. It could go to a frog. And as you can see, there's different pathways that the energy could travel. So what's the main difference between a food web and a food chain? Let's go back to the food chain real quick. If you look here, let's say we wipe out all the lizards in this population. What's going to happen to the snake? Well, the snake is actually the population is going to dwindle because it's not going to have any food. Now, what's going to happen to the locusts? Their numbers are going to increase greatly because now they don't have a predator to keep their population in check. Now, what a food web does is it shows multiple pathways. It shows more biodiversity. And why is that important? Well, let's say this fox depends on this rabbit. Well, if that rabbit is lost from the population or lost from the community, I mean, it might not affect the fox population as bad because now the fox has multiple pathways to get energy from other organisms. It could get it from the mouse. It could get it from the bird. Okay, so the more biodiversity you'll hear, it makes the ecosystem more stable. That's because there's more pathways for the energy to flow. The next model that ecologists will use is called the pyramid of energy. Now, if you remember, we're constantly getting an input of energy from the sun. The sun is giving us all of our energy, and that energy is being converted into a usable form by plants. Now, plants, again, remember, those are going to be our primary producers. And as that energy moves upward, plants are going to give us 100% of our available energy. And as that energy moves upward, it's the rule of 10. Only about 10% of that energy is going to be available at the next trophic level. So when we go to the primary consumers, or the first level that has to eat something, there's only about 10% of that energy that transfers upward. Now when we go to our secondary consumers, only 1/10 of that transfers upward. And that gives us 1%. The tertiary consumer, that would give us 0.1% of that energy. And quaternary, or the fourth level consumer, would give us 0.01% of that energy. So where does the rest of that energy go? Well, that energy is actually being lost as body heat. And that's getting dispersed back into the atmosphere as heat. So as we have this input of energy, we're having a loss of energy as well as heat when we go through respiration. When we look at a pyramid of numbers, this is an ecological model that just shows the amount of individuals in an ecosystem. So the number of individual clovers would increase that trophic level. And you'll see in this specific model, you'll see that as we move upward to primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary, the numbers of individuals actually dwindles. Now, that doesn't always have to be the case. If we look at this model right here, you would see that one oak tree, one individual tree, can be the home for numerous insects, and it could also be the home to numerous birds in a population. So numbers could look a little funky like this. If we look at this pyramid of numbers, you would see that there's a lot of rabbits. I'm sorry, there's not so many rabbits, but there could be a lot of fleas in that ecosystem, and that's because that one rabbit can house a variety of different insects or fleas. And next we get into the cycling of matter. And when we look at the cycling of matter, we're going to see this big, ginormous word. That's bio, geo, chemical cycles. And what that means is bio is life, geo is earth, chemical means matter, and cycles. So essentially what cycles means is everything is being recycled. Okay. Now if you think back to energy is there's a constant input from the sun. However, with matter, there's not a constant input, and all those atoms are just being recycled over and over again. So the cycles that we're going to talk about are the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle.